Okay, Neil, you could come to the front and sit down, and Chris. Gary, could you put my one slide back up, please? Just to talk about this a little bit. So this is, in about a week's time, I'll be on holiday in Barbados, which is here, for a couple of weeks. Go there every year. I've got to know, and a lot of the islands in the chain from Barbados around to Jamaica I've visited. And you probably don't realise, but Barbados has a national oil company. Rejoices in the name of the Barbados National Oil Company, BNOC, which for some people may take us back 20 or 30 years. At the moment, they produce about 1,000 barrels a day onshore. Mainly, their main activity is workover. Their net imports of petroleum, if you include jet fuel as well, are about 10,000 barrels a day. So even at $50 a barrel, if you use that as a price, they're farming out $500,000 a day to somebody else, leaving the island. When the price was 110, it was 400 million a year. Using the sort of British calibration that Neil did, Barbados has a population of 240,000, which is about the size of Oxford, and the island's about the size of Oxfordshire. So it's a hell of a burden for a country like that to take, and it's replicated as you go around the islands here. So one of the questions I posed to myself some years ago, and other people, it's not just me, but I've had it in my head, is there a regional oil play in the Caribbean? Now, Neil has already stated very clearly, really, that there's a Gulf of Mexico play which comes down here and sort of hits the coast of Honduras, and there's a sort of Venezuelan play of which Trinidad is part. My question is, if you go and talk to the geologists, the two of them, sometimes three, but usually two or even one in the BNOC in Barbados, they will say, well, of course, all the oil we have is sourced by the La Luna, may or may not be true, which is the source rock that sources more or less everything in Venezuela. And the main reservoir are deepwater clastics, which have come from the mouth of the Orinoco, which is somewhere in here, I think. And that's 150 kilometers, maybe, a couple of hundred. So, there is a model of, and a question of, is there a regional oil play which kind of works coming up through here? Actually, amazingly, Barbados leased all its acreage to Conoco in about 1999, some huge number of, like 30,000 square kilometers or something. They drilled one well, which rejoiced in the name of Sandy Lane number 1. If you know anything about Barbados, Sandy Lane is actually the big hotel where Sir Philip Green, you're allowed to boo and hiss at this moment, goes, and Simon Cowell and others. And it came up with some gas, and then when Conoco merged with Phillips, they dropped a lot. And that was really the sort of peak of actual drilling activity in here. So I thought, as a panel discussion, we could look at two things. I've asked Chris Matchette Downs, who's founder and director and CEO and so on of Caribex, to talk to us about the rocks, particularly source rocks, and then Neil to perhaps inject a moment of reality, which is just because there's a West Indies cricket team and there's a University of the West Indies and there's a CARICOM, which is you could think of as like the EU, only without that annoying person from Luxembourg who runs it. Despite all that, the regionality doesn't really exist. I think that would be Neil's summary. He may now not feel he doesn't need to speak at all. But Chris, please, over to you. The other thing I would say is Chris did a first, I think, for us, which a speaker arrived with the required USB stick, but it had nothing on it. However, somebody at home has now done the work, and you have your slides.
They'll be up there, I think.
Yeah. So, Chris, over to you. There you are. Very good. Welcome.
Thank you. Now for something completely different. A little bit on the regionality of source rocks. I was given the task in 5 minutes to look at the La Luna. Does it extend over to Barbados? Does it extend further? Is there a regional source system? Does the Apto Albion work? There seem to be about 3 questions in there. I'll try and attempt to answer them. I think it's work in progress. The images here are of exploration and oil occurrences in the Caribbean area. That's the Russians drilling off Cuba. The middle picture is a new seep found on Eastern Dominican Republic, not far from the holiday resorts there. This muddy picture here is the seep on the south coast of the Dominican Republic, and then there's Charat, or the Chinese working off northern Cuba. There is evidence for oil across the Caribbean. Do I do the next slide on this? Yes. All right. There's been some very recent movement in this slide because all the logos have slipped to the east slightly. But it's not as dramatic as that. But you can see from the general fabric, the Caribbean region has got many components to it. You get the sense there's this splurge of islands and land going into the Atlantic, of which Barbados is part of, and their mud diapirs, which we've heard of, sort of supporting this idea of this movement through the Caribbean. There's an argument that some of the Caribbean was already there, and North and South America moved around the core of the Caribbean. It's probably a bit of both. There are several different terrains visible here. If you go from, I don't press this in case it goes forward. Yeah, this is the shortest block. This is the Pacific Ocean, and the upper Nicaraguan rise runs towards Jamaica, and the pointy end of Chortis is where the Blue Mountains rise in complete isostatic non-adjustment, and then to the south of it you have attenuated continental crust, the Sayuna terrain, and it's a vast area. On the edges you have this arc of islands, Cuba around through Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and then round through the Windward Islands into Trinidad, Barbados, Trinidad, and into the Leeward Islands. And the brief was to compare the La Luna in Lake Maracaibo area with other source rocks in the region. The La Luna is a late Cretaceous, variously labelled as Cenomanian to Turonian, late Cretaceous. It's marine, it's calciferous. You can see that data if you look at the oils as well as the source rocks. And there are chert into beds, and it's an average TOC of about 4 to 5%. Other points, I suppose, the majors are beginning to move into this Caribbean area, sandwiched between the oil provinces that we've discussed in the north and the Venezuelan, North American oil province to the south. Statoil are in the Sandino Basin, that's sort of out of the area of discussion today. Shell are in Honduras, and Tullow have got most of the offshore of Jamaica, Pedro Basin, Pedro Bank, Blossom Basin, and beyond. The other thing to note about this is it looks broken up, but it is a vast scale. It takes a couple of hours to fly across it, so it is an enormous area. So what is the La Luna? What does it produce? It produces algal-rich oils. That's a GC of a mature La Luna oil with a very distinctive character in terms of its biomarker assemblages. You can get a lot of information by looking at the oils in terms of the environment of deposition, the maturity of the source rock, and the age of the source rock. So if you can get a seep, as we heard off Campeche, it's worth looking at this kind of detail. And from this, we can tell it's a restricted marine environment. There's a lot of sulfur in there. The nickel-vanadium ratio is very high. And it has a sort of mid-range isotope concentration. To sort of try and understand areas where there hasn't been much drilling or no drilling, you've just got to go into the field, you've got to collect samples, go back to the old data. Sometimes you can't find the source rocks. You look at the oils to tell you about the source rocks. This is in the Omar region of northern Honduras, looking for an oil seep. It was about 40 degrees heat, and we walked for miles and miles and miles and didn't find anything, but sometimes you do. Moving on. I've been looking at the Caribbean over a decade and a bit now, collecting samples, first with Geological, later as my own company, and in recent years as Caribex. And by building up a database of oils, you start to get a feel for what works and what doesn't work, and what is connected and what isn't. And make comparisons to known areas. For instance, we know about the Gulf of Mexico. We heard about the Jurassic source rocks in the Gulf of Mexico, but also there are Cretaceous source rocks and tertiary source rocks. To the south, in the North American plate, you have the Carbonera in the Llanos Basin, a tertiary source system. The La Luna is Cretaceous, Upper Cretaceous, and there are Jurassic source rocks as well, emerging in Suriname perhaps, but in Brazil and so forth. And you can look at those analogues and go back to the seemingly fragmented Caribbean area, and all of those source rocks are occurring there, but they're kind of separated a bit. And if you remember the work people did on the Atlantic when it moved apart, looked at source rocks on one side and the other, this is just a little bit more complicated than that because the pieces have moved around. So, how extensive is this Turonian aged Upper Cretaceous source system? Well, we know from DSDP data in the Venezuelan basin in very deep water, there are very high TOCs in the Turonian, coupled with high hydrogen indices, therefore a good source rock, but not mature in that area. We have collected oils from Hispaniola that have a Cretaceous character, and indeed around the Windward Arc, and we know about the Cretaceous sourced oils on Barbados and in Trinidad. Also some of the wells on Jamaica have encountered elevated TOCs in the Cretaceous, both in the Maastrichtian and older levels. If you want to take that a little further, now in Honduras, this is the reconstruction of Honduras, the Chortis and Sayuna plate by Pindell. If you follow at that time, 46 million years ago, it was immediately south of what is now a prolific oil province in Guatemala that Parenco and others have been exploiting over the years. If you look at the geology, in Petrolatina's website, you can see there are Turonian source rocks, and those same age source rocks have been found in Honduras in the Goa Formation, which is a sort of restricted marine brackish fish bed, now a spent source rock. And there are also older source rocks in the Apta Albion, a second sort of mid-Jurassic source system, both in Honduras. It's called the Eoa group, and it extends up into Guatemala. So we are jumping around a bit, but you have to remember that everything's moved, and there are a lot more samples to fill in the gaps as well. I only have a few moments. But conceivably, the oil, this is going back to make a rough comparison with the La Luna oil, one of many wells, particular characteristics, low diasterenes, the relationship with the sterenes and the gamasserane, and this sort of raising of this final doublet peak here with a high C29 Hopane and so forth, arguably can be seen in the main Cape oil from Honduras, and they have very similar isotope values. And isotope analysis is quite useful because you're looking at large portions of the oil rather than picograms. The Cretaceous isn't the only story, and I'll give one slide on each of the other source systems. There's a very obvious tertiary source system on Jamaica, the Guys Hill Formation, very high TOCs and associated hydrogen indices. The Chapelton well encountered several hundred meters of enhanced source rocks, and to the west in Honduras you have the Punta Gorda Formation, which is again Eocene, with world-class source rock, very high TOCs and hydrogen indices. So you have another regionally extensive source rock, but again broken up, and things have moved on a bit since the Jurassic. There are Jurassic source rocks as well. We saw in the last previous presentation of a survey going around into Belize. There's an oil field that's found some years ago called Belmopan. That oil has been typed to a Jurassic source, the same Smackover Formation sourced oils as you find in Arkansas in the States. And many years ago, I had a project with the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica, and I was able to obtain an oil sample from the Windsor 1 well on the north block of Jamaica, which, when analysed by Geomark Research, to all intents and purposes, it seemed the same oil. And the thought is that perhaps northern Jamaica was close to Belize when you reconstruct the continents. There are other Jurassic source. There are not so many Jurassic source rocks, I think, evidenced in the Caribbean, but on the fringes there appear to be some. But as with the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean has multiple source systems. The Cretaceous seems to be the most obvious, followed by the Tertiary, with some hints of the Jurassic. So it's sort of in time and it's spread out, so it's a little bit more complicated than most systems, and takes a little time to unravel it all. And you have to forget all the country borders and so forth. Each of those spots is an oil sample from one or more countries in the Greater Caribbean region, which I haven't labelled. But they have a particular isotopic character, and that is slightly light, whereas the terrestrial tertiary source rocks have they plot above this line. The black line is a line that Zui Sofer put together based on 600 oils, and the thinking is that certain Crete organisms prefer different isotopic fractionation processes, and therefore the resultant oils will carry that signature, and you can pull the different families of oil apart. And finally, the Jurassic source system, I haven't got many samples from there, but they sort of seem a little heavier isotopically. If you put them all together, obviously it's difficult to pull them apart. But if you can get the oils and look at the other detail through the biomarkers and the metals and so forth, you can actually get some detail. So I would say there is a regional source system. In fact, there's probably two regional ones with some peripheral older source rocks in the area, but you have to remember it's all moved around, and a lot of work is needed to put it all back together again to perhaps give you further encouragement. And that's my view on the Caribbean. Thank you.
Oh, that's exactly what I wanted to be told. Right, so that's great. So you think potentially there is a regional Caribbean oil play, but complicated to get at?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then, Neil, if you start thinking about the above ground issues, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, in my privileged position, I get to attend rather a lot of conferences on the Caribbean, and over the last 5 years, they have often started out with the grand notion of some unifying force, and often we've walked away, as we did a week ago at a Caribbean energy conference in the port of Spain, concluding actually that there is little that binds the interests together, and it's not just about oil, it's about energy and energy provision, and though there is a lot to be learnt between Caribbean states, and they have the ability to do that, they're bound together by certain, like CARICOM and so on, their policy decisions are completely disparate, and as a result, there's not a unifying above-ground interest that really makes much sense other than sharing good ideas. Some finance gets shared across, but essentially it's every man for himself. And if you're in a small energy-poor island where the sun shines a lot, photovoltaics is your main interest, with a desire to get some cheap gas if you can, but who's going to put the infrastructure in to bring you LNG in micro quantities or CNG? And it just, a good idea, but in reality we end up concluding that the policy making for the Caribbean is even more disjointed than the geology.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember, again, Barbados, but 6 years ago, probably, maybe more than that. I mean, I mentioned the deep water plastics coming out of the Orinoco, where they finish up in a big pile in the hills in the north of the island in Scotland, the Scotland area, which is incredibly windy and incredibly sunny at the same time. So they had great ideas of wind turbines and solar power, and I'm betting on Friday afternoon when we fly in there, I can't see either. It just doesn't happen. And yet they've been strangled by this flow of capital out. It's quite sad, really, if you like the place.
But the tenant of my investment story for Trinidad is they're starved for capital as well. So there maybe is a more unifying problem here, which is the lack of capital flowing into the area as opposed to anything else.
Yeah. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Or we? No. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, please. Yeah, don't feel compelled to. I'm not hypnotising people to ask questions, but please go ahead and please say who you are.
Yeah, my name's David Peel from Lukoil, and one thing that struck me is you've got a lot of stranded gas kicking around potentially in these basins, and I wonder why small-scale LNG, barge-scale LNG, that type of thing hasn't really kind of captured the imagination of many or any.
Don't know the answer. Do you know?
I haven't got a view on that.
I mean, it's certainly true, just as again, talking about Barbados, I mean, because it's such a tourist destination, they worry the hell out of oil drilling. 10 miles offshore, pollution, or their real heart's desire would be to have a 3 TCF gas discovery just over there, or even 1 TCF one. So gas is actually an easier.
I'm thinking the smaller scale LNG has a small scale kind of 100 million cubic feet a day, type deal, rather than a big scale Shell type prelude.
Yeah, but I think Neil's point is it needs an investor to see that they can make something out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, there is a lot of discussion across a number of islands to attract, in the case that I'm aware of, CNG and micro LNG projects, which would take gas from Trinidad. But Trinidad itself is suffering a shortage of gas because it's set up in a whole industry based on having a plentiful supply of gas. So the idea that they will invest in the infrastructure to place their gas into other islands was a great idea 5 years ago, but is now has no residual traction. I think they'll sell gas to anybody who will buy it, but they're not going to invest in the supply chain that makes that possible, because they're already over-invested in LNG and their own domestic methanol and urea plants. So, yeah, gas is probably the answer that would bind the Caribbean together. I don't think oil will be, partly for the reasons that Dave mentions. Many islands would rather not now start dabbling in oil this late in the game.
The only comment I'd make to that is there's plenty of evidence of gas in Trinidad, obviously, and in my work in the Caribbean, perhaps only Atlantic Nicaragua has reasonable gas. All the other opportunities seem to be small oil opportunities, so it might be quite a tough one to do.
Yeah, please, Keith.
Nobody's mentioned the biogenic gas yet. In the offshore Colombia, the Colombian Caribbean, there's obviously a lot of, and also Venezuelan Caribbean, there's a lot of biogenic gas.
Yeah, and probably off the Pacific coast as well. It's offshore gas, though, isn't it? So it has that challenge as well, which East Africa is going through at the moment. To find gas in deeper water is quite a hard thing to do. Brazil. Yeah.
Okay.